so I'm keeping Jane on the stage with me. We are ready for the next panel of which Jane will be participating. We're going to take a deep dive into space exploration. Joining Jane is Pete Worden from the Breakthrough Prize Foundation, Omar Hatamleh from NASA, and Guillermo Solain from Blue Marble Exploration and Fortiva Holdings. Welcome, everyone.
I'll give this to you.
All right, so Jane right there. Yep.
Here you are.
Thank you.
All right, Guillermo, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh my goodness, I love Pioneers. This is great. This is, I think, my third or fourth Pioneer, and it's an amazing atmosphere, and it's an amazing venue, right? Like one of the nicest venues in the world.
Spectacular.
Great. All right, so thank you for being here, and thank you for our panelists, and thanks Pete and Jane for your remarks earlier. I thought this was a really interesting question when they kind of posed it to us to come up here and talk about, will we become an interplanetary species? In a way, I thought, given the makeup of this panel and our experiences, that it's a bit of a rhetorical question, because I think all four of us would just say a resounding yes. But I wanted to talk, and actually, just so everyone knows, I think Nikki already told you, but I'm Guillermo, next to me is Pete, and Jane, you've already met both of them, and Omar is on the far end there, just so you can follow along. But I thought this was an interesting question that we were posed, but Pete, I wanted to start with you, because I thought it was interesting when I read the question originally, and maybe it's my own bias, I read it as, will humanity become a transplanetary species? It was interesting, you picked up the nuance in the way it was written. It was actually written, will we become an interplanetary species? And your immediate answer back to me when you talked about it was, well, it depends on what you mean by we. So maybe you can expand a little bit on that.
Well, I think the key question here is that, what are we becoming, even on Earth? I think we're beginning to become sort of biomechanical hybrids. And that generations in the future, the human and machine will be sort of integrated. And I think the key question here is, as we start thinking about settling other worlds, that it's very likely that what we become then are fundamentally different than what we are today. I mean, we're already sort of a hybrid organism anyhow. I mean, there's more microbes in our body than there are human cells. So it's, and this is really the question I talked briefly about from Frank Church, or George Church, is that could you have a biomechanical device that could settle another world and proliferate itself? And I think the question is very likely yes.
Yeah, because it's interesting, especially given the other talks that are going on at Pioneers and some of the other sessions. So it's interesting, some of the progress that's being made and all of that. So maybe Jane, you talked a little bit earlier during your talk about your experience with Biosphere. Obviously, you're focused a lot more on the pure human side. And so from your standpoint, I'll ask you my question, will humanity become an interplanetary species?
Yes, absolutely, but I do think we're going to take a lot of other life along with us. We have to, right? I mean, we've lived within a biospheric context throughout our history. And of course, one of the big questions that we enjoyed fantasizing about while we were in the biosphere is this of a hybrid species. Even when you think about how we move beyond the surface of the planet, it has to be with technology. We can't go any other way. So depending on how you define a hybrid species, we have to take technology and we have to take other life. And yes, we most certainly are going to be a transplanetary species. I thought we'd be on Mars by now, I will just say.
I think all of us did, yeah. So Omar, you dual hat. You've got your role at NASA and then also at the International Space University at Strasbourg. You work on both sides of this stuff, right? Like, what are you seeing coming up in the next 10, 15, 20 years?
Well, first I would like to step back a little bit and see the evolution, how we've gotten to today, for example. If we go back several decades away, we were just spacefaring nations, just looking individually into how to tackle and go into different planets. And then we became more of a collaborative approach, and like what we did with the space station. And then multiple nations worked together to develop a product and share risk resources and expertise. For example, a space station is one of the building blocks and stepping stones. I think it's going to enable us to become more successful at exploring the different planets. We're learning so much every day. We're understanding the effects of microgravity on humans in terms of effects on bone, on muscles, on immunity, on vision. So we're learning a lot of these challenges, and we're learning how to tackle these challenges to enable us to go to different planets. And the third dimension, I think, which is very important, it's happening recently now, is the combination and the synergy that's happening between government, industry, and startup world, right? So basically, they're leveraging on the expertise, on the technologies that have developed and through decades, and using the interesting aspect of the startup world, which is having a little bit more risk, being more innovative, and together we're creating a synergy. I think it's going to giving us a different dimension to be able to get us there much faster. And obviously, education is very important. Technology. So nowadays, for example, the International Space University, the whole program is about interdisciplinarity. So, for example, right now people are engineers, they do engineers, or business people do business. So we're looking at it from a different approach where everybody has to know all the connotation, all the aspects that have to do with space exploration, and giving them all this interesting knowledge to enable them to become much more successful.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I want to stay with you for a second, but quick pause. Wanted to remind the audience, we're not going to really have a Q&A session afterwards, and I think Chris and Nikki mentioned to you Slido, so I've got a tablet here. If you have any questions, they'll pop up here or on the monitor here, so just kind of let me know. So Omar, let's stick with you for a little bit about all these different interdisciplinary approaches, and what kind of mechanisms have you seen for trying to pull these different programs together?
Well, look at it, for example. Nowadays, the best way to tackle things is not being in a silo, in a company or a government agency or corporation or academia. I think it's more of an ecosystem, right? I think government, academia, and industry should work hand in hand to develop all these kind of things. And oftentimes people ask me, what is the most interesting or innovative technology that has been developed? And nowadays it doesn't exist, because there is no single industry that's applied or applicable to one industry. It all spans across the board. Look, for example, at 3D printing. 3D printing was thought it's going to be a technology to develop parts and products, but in fact, for example, it's been developed in the food industry, in the medical field. We're using it recently to develop organs made from your genetic DNA. It's being used in the manufacturing, in the construction industry, in the clothing industry. So obviously for us, it's very essential because when we go to different planets, we cannot take all the spare parts with us, right? So we need to leverage on the local resources and the in situ materials that we have there to develop habitats, to develop 3D printed parts. That is going to be the only way to be able to live in these environments, because it's going to be very expensive, very costly, and difficult to carry all these resources and spares with us to all these vast distances that we need to travel.
Yeah, and I like that. The phrasing of it is an ecosystem, right? Of bringing all these different places together. And I thought it was interesting as we kind of put the panel together that at least our current roles, we've all had different backgrounds, right? But Omar, you're currently government and academia.
Yes.
Jane, you're private sector. Pete, you're on the nonprofit side. What are the roles for all these different groups when we look at making humanity or we a transplanetary species? And Pete, you had an interesting thought on how those 3 or 4 may actually come together.
Well, first of all, they all work together, and there's clearly some overlap. But to my mind, the philanthropic investment is the really high risk but high payoff thing. When we started one of our projects, which was Breakthrough Listen, which was look for an alien signal, our principal sponsor asked us what we thought the percentage likelihood of success was. And we had a bunch of optimists, scientists, and most of us said about 1%. And he said 10 to the minus fifth. And I got to thinking, I'd worked for the government a lot, for decades. If I'd have gone to the government and said I want $100 million for something that the experts think at best is a 1% chance of success, I think I'd have been thrown out of my ear. On the other hand, this is the kind of research, if we found an alien signal, it may be the discovery of all time. So I think the early stage, very high risk but very high payoff investments are philanthropic, which then goes to the government to begin to develop sort of the technology, and then the private sector can really make applications, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. And Jane, you've had experience with both sides of this as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing with some of the government missions to asteroids is a perfect example of where the government is taking on that super pointy end of the stick, going out there and doing things that industry couldn't possibly afford to do. They're validating, they're really bushwhacking, charting a new course for us as industry. In this particular instance, they're going to get samples of the material from these asteroids so that we can actually validate what's there. We think we know what's there, but let's go really see what's there. We've already got several companies that are looking at asteroid mining. So having the government actually bring back samples and help them in some regards validate their business model is incredibly valuable. I mean, that's a perfect example of where I think it really works.
Yeah. Omar, let me shift topics a little bit with you. You brought it up a little bit. I also thought it was interesting that they basically we basically put 4 Americans up here. Okay, a Brit living in the U.S., but basically we've got a very U.S.-centric focus, but we're speaking to a European audience sitting in Austria. One of the things that I've found fascinating over the last 15 years, especially over the last 5 years within space, is the mass globalization of everything that we've been doing. And I think one or both of you mentioned it during your talks. You've got a role at NASA, but also at the International Space University. Like, what have you seen as far as progress from companies, nonprofits, governments throughout the world getting involved with this kind of work?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. But before we do that, I just wanted to give you where the state of technology is today, for example. Do you know that 90% of all the scientists that lived on Earth are alive today? If we look, for example, at the patents in the last 20 years, we've gone completely exponential. That tells you how many people, not in a single continent, but on a global scale, are working together to develop these amazing technologies, which are the building blocks to be able to take us forward. And nowadays, I mean, I don't think anybody, a company, private, government, academia, work individually. It's completely international collaboration. We work hand in hand. We share resources, we work to mitigate the risk and develop new things. So that, like I said, the days that where people work individually, these are long gone. Now it's completely an international effort, and which is a good thing, because the more diversified your team is, the more innovative it is, right? Because sometimes what we call groupthink, when we're solving problems, if we have only engineers, then you tend to think in a certain context only. If you bring people from different backgrounds, for example, with different continents, with different countries, with different ages even, the solutions and the concepts that you get are beyond your imagination. So it's very important to do it at an international level from all these benefits. There's an unimaginable amount of benefits from working and collaboratively on an international stage.
Right.
I can throw out a couple of stats for you.
Yeah.
That hints at that, I think. So there are 80 different countries now that have satellites in orbit. And last year in 2018 was the first year where US and non-US VC funding going into space startups was about roughly 50-50.
Right. So, sorry, I'm looking down because, thank you, I'm getting a lot of questions on Slido, so this is great. So I'm noticing that there's a common theme, and this is actually a great set of questions. I'm going to boil it down to one question, and I don't know who wants to take this on. But the 4 of us have been working in this for a long time, and we run the risk that we're kind of in our own bubble, right? And we just kind of naturally assume that we will become a transplanetary species, or we're dedicating our lives to doing this. And now we're coming to the point of it's technically feasible, technologically feasible. The question we always have to wrestle with, and other people wrestle with, is just because we can do it, should we do it, right? Yeah. We've got plenty of problems on our own planet to deal with. We've got a lot of evidence that we're kind of ruining our own planet. Should we really go and start ruining someone else's planet or another planet? So I guess the question is, even if we can do it, should we do it?
Yeah.
Pete?
Well, I think this is really the fundamental question. And this gets into ethics and philosophy, and it's very much an open issue. And do you focus on something else? Now, I think we will do it because there's things that we can do, people tend to do. But the question is, there needs to be a lot of discussion first. And it's I'm sort of reminded You talk about destroying our planet, and so why we move on to another one. And Jane mentioned asteroid mining. I remember a bumper sticker when I was a graduate student that said, "Save the Earth." And below it, it says, "Let's strip mine the other planets first." But actually, there's a relevant point there. Jeff Bezos, who I think today has got a major announcement from Amazon, has said that what he wants to do is move heavy industry off the planet, and so that we can preserve the planet. So I think this is a very open issue. I mean, I tend to be an optimist and an enthusiast, but I think there needs to be a lot more philosophical, ethical, and political discussions on it.
Either of you two want to weigh in on this one? Should we do it?
Yeah, so the thing is, nowadays is it's a public awareness. You need to make sure that the public is aware what are the value and the benefits. Why are we spending so much money in technology to develop space applications? It's not, if there's certain studies, and one of them says for every $1 that you spend on space, you get $3 back in return in the economy. I mean, a lot of the amazing technologies and discoveries that we have come across and has helped humanity flourish have come because of the amazing investment that came into the space field. So we can go through tons and tons of examples. Every year, for example, at NASA, we have a spin-off manual or handbook that tells you that year specifically all these spin-off technologies that were intended for space that could be used to create new economies, right, and new value. But also, if you look at where we're going in the overall economic space field, it's getting close to $400 billion. And we're starting to see actually a snowball effect that nations that are not specifically in that space field wanted to retool and retweak their current infrastructure to be able to be retweak it to be able to help in space, developing space applications, and be part of this huge economical value that's being created by space. So we're starting to see more value, I think, but we definitely need to do a better job at creating better public awareness and let them understand that how the connection between what's spending in space comes back to Earth multiple folds.
Yeah, I always found that interesting because you got, number one, dual-use technologies, right? So as you were mentioning, some of the technologies we have to develop to do these things out in space can also be used to solve some major problems here on Earth. The other is, I think it gives you the more and more we go off-planet and we realize how harsh that environment is, it makes us appreciate Earth even more and preserve it even more. Jane, I imagine you probably had this perspective from when you went into Biosphere 2. All of a sudden, and by the way, one of the questions that was asked was directed at you. What was one of the hardest things about being in Biosphere 2 for so long? But I imagine that being in there probably gave you a greater appreciation for Biosphere 1, right?
Yes, so one of the coolest experience of being in Biosphere 2, personal experience, was that of really viscerally experiencing being part of my biosphere. You know, we drank the same water over and over again, we breathed the same oxygen, my CO2 helped the food I was growing grow, which I then ate, and so we were actually becoming visibly part sweet potato because we were all turning orange. So I mean, we were just really a part of this biosphere, which made us have a very similar outlook to that which astronauts have when they go to space. You know, when astronauts come back from going to space, nearly every one of them talks about this incredibly transformative experience of seeing the Earth from space. You know, that's why I want to take people there. That's why I so want to take people to space so that they have that experience. We had something similar to that inside Biosphere 2. So I was also involved in Inspiration Mars that was going to be, should it have actually happened, be a public-private partnership where we were going to do a flyby Mars. And one of the reasons I was so excited about that was for similar reasons. I mean, can you imagine having two ambassadors from the Earth going to Mars, being the first people looking back at Earth and seeing this little tiny pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan called it, and pointing to that and saying, look, that's where all human history, that's where all life's history as we know it has occurred. And being able to give this mirror, really shine a mirror, you know, really put up a mirror to Earth. You know, I mean, I think there's all kinds of philosophical and practical reasons that we can give about going to other places off the Earth. Certainly that's one of them.
Yeah, it's interesting because Omar, you kind of talked about public outreach and education, and Jane, effectively, we talked about the overview effect that astronauts talk about, right? When almost every astronaut I've talked to says the same thing. They go up into space, they look back at the Earth, and it just gives them this greater appreciation for planet Earth and our home. And everyone always says the same thing. If we could just get all world leaders up into space and look down, we'd probably eliminate all of our problems, because up there you don't see national boundaries, you don't see any of these things, you just see one planet. So let me shift gears a little bit, kind of bringing it back to the audience, and I think, Jane, you touched on this during your talk. Assuming that we should do these things, and assuming that technologically it's feasible over the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years, whatever it is, what can entrepreneurs today, innovators today, technologists today, investors today, what kinds of things can they get involved with that would help move the ball forward a little bit on any of these fronts? And I don't know who wants to take that.
Something I'm noticing actually that a lot of corporations and government and so on, they invest in technologies, they spend so much time. And in fact, this technology might be invented with somebody's garage, but people are not aware of. So I've been trying to do recently, we're establishing, I think, forging a good relationship with the venture capitalist world. It gives you access to what's happening in people's garages, what's happening in the startup world before it becomes known to anybody else, before it's being published. And sometimes, you can invest millions of dollars and years developing something when in fact it already exists. All you have to do is find out where is it, and how can I connect the dots to be able to do these kind of things. But also something else I wanted to bring up as well, I think, is we need to inspire the future generations, which is going to be the future engine of the economy. And by exploring other planets, by trying to do difficult challenges, I think it will help with the STEM education and help people that are not thinking about going into these difficult sciences, inspire them to be able to embark in these journeys and be able to intake and help with developing the new economies of the future. I think that's a very essential foundation as well.
It's interesting you bring up the generational change, especially in my mind, kind of looking at the entrepreneur community. So I was giving a talk yesterday about the changes in entrepreneurial space over the last 15, 20 years or so. And I remember in 2000, 2004, there was all this big news when Jeff Bezos started Blue Origin and Elon Musk started SpaceX and Richard Branson announced Virgin Galactic. And these were hyper-successful entrepreneurs in other industries who were coming in and starting space-related ventures. At the time, I thought, well, if we're going to have this massive sea change and get to this global private economy, we were going to need a lot more than just 3 or 4 or 5 wealthy entrepreneurs doing this. We're going to need a lot more successful entrepreneurs from other venture industries coming in and starting space-related ventures. And so I started this group called the International Association of Space Entrepreneurs in 2003, specifically to bring successful entrepreneurs from other industries into space-related ventures. The interesting thing is, fast forward now 15 years, and I'm fascinated going around the world, finding how many entrepreneurs, young and old, are starting space-related ventures as their first venture. Right? It's like their first entrepreneurial venture is a space-related venture. Somehow the mind shift has changed over the last decade or so, that there's enough opportunity in space-related industries, there's enough capital coming in, that it makes sense for an entrepreneur, an innovator, to start a space-related company, even as their first venture. I don't know if you've seen...
Yeah, for sure. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I think the interesting thing, I've been a small spacecraft enthusiast, maybe zealot would be a word for it, for decades, and I'm still doing that. But we've gone from very expensive things that were 1,000 kilograms that cost hundreds of millions of dollars to things that were tens of kilograms that cost a few million, down to CubeSats, these kilogram class things that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, down to these which cost about 100. And I think that the fact that the cost of entry is now to the point where you don't need a billionaire investor to do something really cool, and that 3 folks in a garage can do something, and there's some good stories about that didn't have a lot of money.
Yeah, so I'm reminded of also on top of that, which is hugely powerful. I showed the photograph of the guys at Vector carrying along a rocket. I mean, that's just a completely different way of thinking about starting a rocket company, right? But I'm reminded also of the mindset. So I used to race motorbikes, and there was a track, and there was always a track record that nobody could break, and that track record stuck stuck there for years. And finally, one new guy comes to the track, crushes the track record, and the next thing you know, everyone is breaking the track record. It's like these mental blocks. And I think one of the things that's happened in the space industry, we've broken down that mental block. I mean, you're seeing these folks come in and starting they're in some cases, very successful companies out of their garage. And so that is also then allowing other people to come in with that same mindset, really bring the entrepreneurial spirit to it. So it's super exciting.
Right. And in addition, actually, to developing technologies to get us to other planets, now the second part of the equation is how to sustain life there. How do we create, for example, synthetic biology that can help us create new plants, new nutrition? How do we protect ourselves long term? But also, if we talk about interdisciplinarity, is what governance models, what rules, what laws will be available there, how people can live with each other. So that is the first challenge of getting there, but the second challenge is sustaining long viability in these planets and how that's going to look like. And by the way, can we learn from that and bring things back to Earth or not? So that's another dimension we need to explore as well.
I think one of the things that's been interesting, drawing parallels to what's happened in other areas of society, is just the infrastructure that gets built up. It's kind of exponential. It builds on each other, right? Yeah. So initially it was lowering the access to space. So you've got the Elons and the Jeffs and all that stuff. But then you've got, okay, what are we going to put up there? So now the next wave was satellite imagery and all that. So now you've got people putting up constellations of satellites. So you got more people stacked up on top of that. Then there's entrepreneurs that can come in and do something with that data that's coming down. So you had a lot of imaging startups and data startups. Very similar to what happened, let's say, with the internet. First you had the infrastructure for the internet, and then the World Wide Web, and then you had e-commerce, and then online media, and just everything gets stacked up on top of that. It seems like every layer that gets stacked up on top of that gets exponentially bigger and bigger and bigger. Sure. So it feels like, maybe that's why we're excited, right? Having worked on this, exactly. It feels like we're on our way, right? Is that how you're feeling too?
Yeah, totally. So I love to comment back to Bezos again, Jeff Bezos. He made this great comment about when he started Amazon, the reason he could do what he did was there was this entire infrastructure. There were already, the internet was there. There was already trucks and trains and whatever that could deliver things. He had the entire infrastructure that allowed him to do this now meteorically successful company. And so as you're saying, this entire infrastructure is getting built out. New industries are going to come along that we can't even think about today that build on that. I remember 20 years ago we were talking about gas stations for satellites and vehicles in space. Well, we're getting to the point now where that's actually becoming viable from a business point of view. Before it was sort of like, oh, the government's going to pay us to have a gas station in the sky. And now it's actually, maybe people are going to want to keep their satellites up longer. So all these crazy ideas are becoming a reality and a viable business.
And I think that's a perfect point to end this panel on, because for this audience in particular, right? We're excited about what's going on. We think it's viable. We know it's viable. Yeah. At least we believe we should do it. The nice thing is a lot of other people have laid a great foundation for imaginative, visionary, innovative entrepreneurs and investors like everyone in the audience. So I think the four of us would probably challenge all of you to be as creative as possible and build and build and build, and eventually we will become an interplanetary species. I want to thank Omar, Jane, and Pete for joining me on stage, and thank you for your time and attention. Thank you.
Thank you.
Omar and Guillermo, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.